Thank you, Bill. And without further ado, then I do want to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Manuel Pastor, who is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Pastor holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, is the inaugural holder of the Turpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change. He currently directs the Equity Research Institute. Dr. Pastor's research has generally focused on issues of the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movements seeking to change those realities. His work culminates in his most recent book, State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future. Pastor has served as a member of the Governor's Task Force on Jobs and Business Recovery and as a public member of the Strategic Growth Council in California. He also previously served as a member of the Commission on Regions appointed by California Speaker of the State Assembly and as a member of the Regional Targets Advisory Committee for the California Air Resources Board. So in order for us to have a productive conversation, we welcome comments and we welcome also questions in the Q&A section. So I think some of our aides will post some of the citations that come up during the presentation, but if you have any specific questions, please feel free to post them and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And so without further ado, welcome Dr. Pastor, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here. Glad that Alobo remembered our conversation. I suppose it's a little bit of careful what you wish for, because I wound up having to do a lot of work to make a decent up-to-date presentation for you. So hope it'll go well. I also really want to honor my friends Nunu Kidane and Ama Kasa. Ama is the person who's really pioneered doing the demographic work around Black immigrants in the United States. It is also the Nana who essentially said, you know, you guys ought to do this for California. Why don't you do it? And sort of moved us into doing it. And it's, of course, our good friends at BAJI as well, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, who we worked with on our first State of Black Immigrant California. That's a little bit of an update of what I'm going to present today. I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint in just a minute, because what would a professor be without a PowerPoint? It's like incomplete in terms of our emotional well-being. But I also wanted to let people know as I begin to speak that if while I'm talking, my voice breaks or it gets a little bit tired, if you think that it's because I'm just emotional being at this conference, that's probably part of it. But another part of it is that I have a speech condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box, which can cause your voice to be scratchy or break. So that's part of my role that I've got. I always like to let people know that it gets treated, and this is true, once a month with Botox, because that's pretty much how we treat every health condition in Los Angeles. So let me switch to the PowerPoint, and in a slightly different way. I think some of you may have seen this before, but this is a way of doing a PowerPoint where I'm still actually with you down in the little corner right there. Sometimes I'll duck out of the way so that you can see, for example, my Twitter handle. But what I'm going to do today is to talk to you and present a little bit of data, actually quite a bit of data, on Black immigrants in the Golden State. And let me just set up for you why it is that I think this is sort of so important for us to pay attention to. In the United States generally, the Black immigrant population has increased pretty dramatically in recent decades, and you'll see what it's been looking like in California in particular. And much of that increase in Black immigrant population has come from Africa, partly as a result of the diversity lottery that Bill Hing was speaking about, but also certainly lots of migration from the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, and then also lots of Afro-Latinos, Black folks from Latin America who are coming into the United States as well. As people have come into the United States, they've faced both a hostile reception because of the structural racism that is part and parcel of the United States, but also a kind of changing political environment, in which Black Lives Matter movement, came to be, led, of course, by, at least in part, by Black immigrant women, and a kind of increasing sort of understanding of the role of structural racism in the United States, perhaps most dramatically in the last year after the murder of George Floyd and the reckoning with racism that the country's had to go through. But it's been a sort of slow boil, both in terms of the tough conditions that Black people in the United States have faced, but also this kind of tremendous organizing. I mean, Black Lives Matter didn't pop onto the scene after the murder of George Floyd. Years and years of work in building that network. And similarly, there's been years and years of work in building national networks of Black immigrants. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which was doing both representation around Black immigrants, but also African Americans, that is US born Black folks, and their relationship to non-Black immigrant groups. There's, of course, African Communities Together, headed by Amahakasa, the Black Immigration Network, the Haitian Bridge Alliance, which has been doing fantastic work, and of course, the African Advocacy Network as well. So populations growing, hostile changing political environment, a kind of growing maturation in the national networks that can provide voice. And in California, California's become a major destination for Black immigrants, but they're often invisibilized and not understood. Invisibilized because, you'll see in a minute, Black immigrants are a very small share of immigrant California. However, immigrants are a relatively large share of Black Californians. And that kind of asymmetry is really something that's very important to understand. And Black immigrants in California are facing particular possibilities, but also particular challenges, some of which we will hear a little bit about, but certainly some of them have to do with a lot of the realities around, let me just move to the next slide. Some of them have to do with the realities around criminalization and deportation. So for example, as a share of immigrants, and then compare that to the share of folks who are in deportation proceedings, the overrepresentation factor of Black immigrants is twofold. That is, their share in ICE proceedings is twice the share of Black immigrants, Black folks as a share of immigrants in the United States. Historically, Haitian families in recent years have been the largest family group in ICE detention. And then when you start to look at ICE itself, what you see is that Black folks might be in the less than 10% of the ICE detainees, but they're about 25% of people who've been placed in solitary confinement by ICE. So the kind of criminalization of Black people in the United States, which has created a kind of prison to deportation pipeline for so many, is also accompanied by cruelty, anti-Black cruelty that's within the ICE detention system itself, showering special attention, difficult and unwanted attention on Black immigrants as well. Now, another kind of opportunity and complexity is that Black immigrants are often within the movement felt they feel unseen. Their issues are not lifted up. When people talk about immigrants, there's often talk about Latinos and Asians, but not so much about Black immigrants. That's, of course, one of the reasons for this conference. But also, Black immigrants are expected to bear an extra burden. And by this, I mean, some of you who are old enough like me remember the great third world feminist book, This Bridge Called My Back, in which there's a discussion of feminists of color having to deal with the issues of race and patriarchy at the same time, and having to carry burdens within multiple communities of lifting up different issues. For Black immigrants, lifting up issues of Black people within immigrant movements, lifting up issues of immigrants within Black spaces, which may be dominated by people who are US born and not necessarily thinking about the immigrant experience, that's a kind of dual role that is very, very special. So it's a particular role, it's a complex role, it's an important role, but it's a role that's often not supported by funders and by others who don't understand the complexity. So there's a need for Black immigrants to be seen in both movements and policy. And this is where data comes to the rescue. I had the Equity Research Institute at USC. Our slogan is data and analysis to power social change. And so what we tried to do is to do the disaggregation and visibilization that many people do not. And so we wanted to do for this conference, building on a report that we did for Baji about Black immigrants in California, is to try to take a look at the situation of Black immigrants in California in a quantitative way. So for those of you who like stories more than data, there's going to be a storytelling session after this. And I will try to also entertain you as I present data and tell you stories about the data. Although I have to say, if you don't like data, I really don't even understand you because I just love data. And I think data and maps are so important to being able to get a full picture. Now, a full picture is not full without stories and without the human element, but data is a kind of architecture for those stories as well. So what kind of data did we put together for this presentation? Well, we took the 2014-2018 American Community Survey, which is the answers to a census-like instrument, very large sample size, that the government uses to try to get a sense of who exists in the United States. And one of the very cool things about the American Community Survey, the ACS, is that you can get individual answers. So if the census doesn't tabulate Black immigrants, we can. We can take the individual answers and say, well, who said that they were Black in some form, and I'll get to that, and who said that they were foreign born, and then we can disaggregate that by age and by gender and by region of origin and a number of other things that we'll present. So that's a really useful data set. Another useful data set is the current population survey. This is done monthly, but there's something that's called the annual supplement that's done in March. The cool thing about the annual supplement is that you can get the nativity of parents even if you're an adult. So, for example, in the American Community Survey, we know if your parent is an immigrant, only if you're living with a parent, because that's a household-based survey. And so only if we only know about the kids. But in the current population survey, the nativity question about where did your parents come from is asked even of adults. So for example, I'm second generation. My dad was born in Cuba. I'm like 64 years old. He's dead. I definitely don't live with him. It would not be captured in the 2014-2018 American Community Survey, but it is captured in the CPS, which allows us to ask questions about the second generation, which is, of course, a very, very important group for reasons that we'll get into in a minute. However, for both of these, there are issues of small sample size because of Black immigrants being relatively small share of immigrants, and the current population surveys and actually a very small survey generally, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But with a little bit of that nerd stuff out of the way, although there's more nerd stuff to come, don't worry about that. Who are Black immigrants and kind of what definitions are we using in the presentation today? So I want to say something about how we're defining Black immigrants. Of course, we are defining Black immigrants by whether or not you were foreign born. And now that could mean you're naturalized. It could mean that you have a green card, an LPR, student visa, or that you're undocumented. When the census asks about ethnicity and race, they ask two questions. Are you Latino, Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And then your race. And they have either someone who marks that they're Black only, or someone who marks some other race, and they can put down Black or the other races as well. So our definition of Black in this case is someone who marks Black only, or someone who includes Black as part of their multiracial identity. Now, the multiracial stuff is small relative to the share of people who mark themselves as Black only, but there's a couple of advantages of doing this. One is that you capture a lot more Latinos who might, because you're not asking the question, did they also have to say that they were non-Hispanic? But also Latinos tend to mark Black and other, for example, or multiracial. And so we're kind of picking this up. So in any case, the definition of Black immigrant is someone who marks that they're Black, or someone who marks that they're Black in combination with another ethnic group. And why this is important is that particularly with the CPS stuff, what we're able to do is to take a look at both Black immigrants and second generation youth. And so what I have here is, I could have put Nipsey Hussle, of course, but this is Issa Rae, who has one Senegalese parent and one US-born African-American parent. She is part of second generation, and we wanted to be able to take a look at that as well in the CPS. So what did we find in the data? And trying to make sure, I'm hoping that you can see the entire slide, including the base. Karina, can you acknowledge that by coming off video and nodding? Okay,
Yes,
perfect, because
yes,
part of
yes.
it's obscured for me. Okay, so what you can see by taking a look at this graph is that there was actually a pretty big increase in the Black immigrant community in the 1980s compared to the increase in total population in California. Important thing to realize is that was off a very small number of Black immigrants, because it really wasn't until the diversity lottery in 1980 that the bigger influx of the immigrants from Africa, for example, began arriving. You can see that the share of the growth of Black immigrants is more stable in the 1990s because what we've got in this particular situation is that we're starting now from a base that kind of grew in the 80s from 1980 to 1990, but still fewer were coming in compared to the total population growth in California. But in the most recent period, 2000 to 2018, you can see that the growth of Black immigrants, now this is pretty reliable because you've got you had by the year 2000, certainly more than 100,000 Black immigrants in the state. So this is really a pretty sharp increase, and one that suggests that this population is growing. So it was, again, this African migration was spurred in part by changes in the United States, the 1980 Refugee Act and the 1990 Diversity Visa Program, which began to create the possibilities for people to come. California has become a destination, not just for people arriving directly from their countries, but also migrating from the East Coast. That is starting in New York, and then actually and or Florida, and then making one's way to California. And then, of course, another part of the growth of the Black immigrant community is the Afro-Latino and Caribbean communities coming through the Mexican border. Afro-Latinos, Black Mexicans, and really a large share of Black people from Central America, and then many Haitians and others who are Caribbean who have actually come in through the Mexican border, sometimes seeking asylum, sometimes coming as undocumented, but coming through what would have been traditional chains of Mexican migration. So why so little attention to what is really an incredibly important phenomenon? So this is the race and ethnic composition of US-born Californians and immigrant Californians. You can see that Black people are about, oh, I'm sorry, a legend didn't show up here, my bad. But the thing to, I'll describe it to you and correct it in the next chart, next time I show this. But the blue, Black folks, the orange, Latinos, the gray is white folks. The yellow is Asian Americans. And then there's a small number of indigenous folks, and the green is other. But the thing to pay attention to here is that of US-born Californians, Black folks are about 9%, but they're less than 2% of immigrant Californians. You can see that for the, the orange it looks like is actually the white group. For the white group, about 46% of US-born Californians, only about 13% of immigrant Californians, Latinos, 34% of US-born Californians, more than half of immigrant Californians, and of course, the Asian population, about a third of immigrant Californians, because for those of you who don't know this, the Asian population is much more immigrant than any other ethnic population in California. So that's one of the reasons why people pay less attention to Black immigrants. Another part of it, of course, is racism that invisibilizes Black people generally in the discussions that occur in the academy and in politics and in general in the United States. But when you're only 2% of the immigrant population and Latinos are about half and Asians are another third, you can see why that's part of the fact that less attention gets paid to the Black immigrant community and one of the frustrations of Black immigrants as a result of this. But you can see, looking at this in a different way, this is the share of immigrants, share of Californians who are immigrants by race and nativity, ethnicity, and again, unfortunately, here the labels disappeared, but the 7% of Black Californians are immigrants, about 10% of white Californians are immigrants, about 36% of Latino Californians, about 2/3 of Asian Californians. But what's fascinating here is looking at the share of Black people who are immigrant or second generation. And here, what's going on is that I'm sure, kind of hoping my labels appear elsewhere. I don't know how they disappeared. But here what's going on is that about, in California, 7%, as I mentioned before, of Black Californians are immigrant, but another 10% are second generation, meaning they've got an immigrant parent, they're Black themselves generally, and they've got an immigrant parent that is Black. So this is, almost a fifth of the Black California population that's affected by the, oh, that's interesting. They're not showing up on my screen, but thank you for your feedback. So you can see the labels, that's fantastic. So what's going on is that this is really a fifth of California's Black population somehow impacted by the immigration issues. So where do people live? This is the Black immigrant population in terms of numbers by various locations in California. You can see that the bulk of Black immigrants, not the majority, but the significant plurality, live in Los Angeles and Orange County, a whole other group that's in the Bay Area, big group actually in San Diego and Imperial County, and also Riverside and San Bernardino. So probably familiar to some of you, that's where you have grew up, lived, etc. And what I'm going to do right now, because I'm seeing a little bit of reaction to the, not seeing the slides, is I'm going to change the share to drop myself out of the picture and instead have you see the slides a little bit better. And I will move the slides forward to where we were. And this just shows you the percent of the Black population by region that is immigrant. And you can see that share is particularly high in the Bay Area and in San Diego. Perhaps no surprise to people who are familiar with communities like City Heights, which you can see here in these next set of maps. In these maps, each dot represents Black immigrants. And one of the things, if you're familiar with the geography, is that you'll see this concentration of a Black immigrant population in the sort of City Heights neighborhood within San Diego. When you look at Los Angeles County, you're going to see if you move up to Palmdale and Lancaster, very few Black immigrants, so there's quite a few Black people. But quite a large number of Black immigrants in the South LA area, with a lot of those Black immigrants there that are Afro-Latino, Belizean, Afro-Centroamericano, which is why there's a big group in the sort of core area of South LA heading down the Vermont Avenue corridor. One thing that's actually been somewhat surprising from this data, but accurate, and I know that the African Advocacy Network will be happy to see this, is the large number of Black immigrants who are throughout the Bay Area, both in San Francisco, despite the deep shrinkage in the Black population, and of course in the East Bay, throughout the East Bay. And then finally in Sacramento, it's a little bit scattered, but I had to do this because one of the folks who was working with us, who unfortunately just left, was herself the daughter of Black immigrants. And so kind of had to put that slide in. So where do Black immigrants in California come from? This shows you for 2010, 2014. I wanted to point this out because you'll see that in 2010, 2014, which is really just 4 or 5 years ago, about 9% of Black immigrants came from Mexico, about 13% from Central America, about 17% from West Africa, et cetera. Want you to look carefully what's happened in just a very short period of time. In just a very short period of time, the share of Black immigrants from Mexico and Central America has actually gone down. And the share of immigrants who are from West Africa, East Africa, rest of Africa, and other has actually gone up. So increasingly, this Black immigrant population is not Afro-Latino, but from Africa and from the Caribbean and from other locations. Now, other could include people who were Black folks who went from Africa to Europe, and then the country that they're coming from is a European country, or maybe they were the second generation there of African parents, but born in France. And so the country that's being listed is France. Now, this origin differs dramatically. And here I think the thing that's the most interesting to see and probably makes some sense to you is the Bay Area and San Diego. The largest share of Black immigrants are identifying as coming from East Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, et cetera. So by contrast, in Los Angeles, you can see a very large share, Los Angeles and Orange County, a very large share of Black immigrants who identify as coming from Central America. What's the gender distribution by race and ethnicity? This compares Black immigrants, Latino immigrants, and API immigrants. You can see that it's actually pretty balanced for both Black immigrants and Latino immigrants. For API immigrants, Asian Pacific American Islander immigrants, a little bit more female than male. Gender distribution by region of origin. The only really significant thing that jumps out here is from Central America. There is a larger share of females, women migrants, than male migrants, and that's the most significant imbalance. It's a little more female as well from East Africa, but you can see that those are really important for understanding gender dynamics as well. What about documentation status? What this shows you is something that might be surprising to many, but we've seen it in other data as well, is that Black immigrants have a pretty high propensity to naturalize. That's a much higher share, for example, than Latino immigrants who are naturalized. About 58% are naturalized of Black immigrants in California. About another 30% are green card holders, have the legal right to be in the country. But about 12% of Black immigrant Californians are undocumented and therefore quite susceptible to some of the dynamics that I was talking about before in terms of deportation and the prison to deportation pipeline that advocates talk about. This is a little bit different by region of origin. In particular, Mexican immigrants, Afro-Mexicano immigrants tend to be much more likely to be undocumented, but those are pretty high numbers, 12%, from both West Africa and East Africa. And so that's a very significant issue in the Black immigrant community. What does educational attainment look like? This is comparing educational attainment for essentially working age folks between the ages of 25 and 64, and Black immigrants compared to non-Hispanic whites, Black folks who are US born, Latinos who are US born, Latino immigrants, AAPI, US born, AAPI immigrants. A couple of striking things here. Black immigrants actually have a relatively high share of folks with less than a high school degree, but they've also got a fairly high share of people who have a master's degree or better. And the numbers here are a little off. I'll get to that. So I'm going to just jump over this and move to the educational attainment of Black individuals 25 to 64. And here what we're taking a look at is the relationship between Black folks who are US born in California and Black folks who are US born but second generation, meaning that their parents were immigrants. And what you're going to see here is something that's, again, somewhat interesting, which is for the Black US born second generation, you have an interesting contradiction, which is that you got a higher share of folks with less than a high school degree, but you also have a higher share of folks with graduate school or better. And in general, a higher share of folks who have completed a bachelor's degree or obtained a master's degree. And now this is a very significant thing. Many of you know about the dynamics that go on between African Americans and Black immigrants around school opportunities, and in particular, some of the sorting that takes place, particularly at selective universities, where there's a much higher share of second generation and or Black immigrant folks who are let into those universities than US born African Americans of Black parents. It's something that's created some tensions between the communities. It's something that does show up in the data. A couple of other data points. Black, I'm going to just jump to the current period. Black immigrants tend to be more underinsured. That's that little gray thing there. No health insurance, than non-Hispanic whites, and then by US born Black folks. Although the group that's got the highest share of folks with no health insurance are Latino immigrants who have this much higher rate of being undocumented, which is one of the reasons why they're not able to access the issues of insurance. This just shows you this by region of origin, and that the problem of lacking health insurance is particularly pronounced for Afro-Latinos. I'm going to move to a couple of things, and then I'm going to try to bring this to a conclusion a little bit quickly so that we can actually deal with some questions that might be in the chat and some conversations. This is a chart that is worth understanding, takes a little bit of time to explain. Moving horizontally are the education levels. Moving vertically are the median annual wages for full-time year-round workers by race and nativity. And the thing to understand about this is the following. As you move up in education, your wages go up. This is what your parents told you. Hopefully this is the reason why some of the students are realizing they need to stick in school. It's partly to learn things, but it's also, it could help with your education. But one of the things to realize here is that at each and every level of education, we see that non-Hispanic whites do better than every other ethnic group, with the exception of AAPI immigrants who do better with a master's degree or higher. One of the things you'll see is that US-born non-Hispanic Black folks and Black immigrants follow more or less the same trajectory. Education raises wages, but there's still significant disparities between Black folks and white folks, regardless of immigration status. Discrimination continues to exist in the workplace, in hiring, in promotion, and in wages, and it affects both Black US-born folks and Black immigrants. This little data on English proficiency. You can see that for Black immigrants in general, pretty high rates of English proficiency. That differs substantially by region of origin, with Mexico having the lowest level, Central America being higher. That's partly because Belize and is counted as part of some of those data at times. In terms of recency of arrival, meaning how long have you been in the country, the blue is people who migrated a long time ago. As you move up, it's people who migrated a little more recently. The yellow is people who migrated less than 10 years ago. And what you'll see, it's perhaps no surprise, is that the group that's the most recent in its arrival is Black immigrants, particularly as compared to Latino immigrants, but also even as compared to Asian Pacific Islanders, who have a share of people who arrived a long time ago that is higher, and a share of immigrants who arrived less than 10 years ago that is lower. So Black immigrants more recently arrived, one of the other reasons for invisibilization. This differs by region of origin, with, you can see here, recency of arrival, particularly being recently arrived, being particularly pronounced for West and East Africans and folks from other parts of Africa, particularly South Africa. Homeownership rates, surprisingly low for Black immigrants, given the education levels that we pointed to. And you'll see some stuff about migration, about income, education and how it affects income. So what it looks like when you see this, part of what explains the pattern is that people who are more recently arrived are less likely to own. See that in a minute. But it's also fascinating that the homeownership rates for both Black immigrants and Black US born is roughly the same, suggesting that the issues of really continuing racial discrimination in lending and real estate sales continues to occur and to affect Black folks, regardless of whether US born or immigrant. This shows you that this is trying to control for recency of arrival. And one of the things that you'll notice here is that even when you say, well, let's just look at recency of arrival and group people by whether they're recently arrived, so less likely to buy a home, arrived some time ago, or arrived a long time ago, that at each and every level of those recency of arrival markers, Black immigrants have lower home ownership rates than other immigrants. And so this does reflect the patterns of discrimination that I was talking about. I'm going to jump over this and this, just to point out that Black immigrants have been a little more affected by unemployment than non-Hispanic whites and Latino immigrants. But the group most affected by unemployment, and this is even prior to the crisis, is US-born Blacks. I'm going to just jump over these. However, the poverty rate by race and ethnicity, you can see that this is higher for Black immigrants, much higher than it is for non-Hispanic whites who are US-born, a little bit less than the poverty rate for Black native-born, and a little bit less than the poverty rate for Latino immigrants. What's the takeaway from this? If you look at those employment rates, they were pretty high. If you look at the poverty rates, they're pretty high. So what that means is that for a lot of Black immigrants, there are certainly issues of unemployment and detachment from the labor force, but perhaps the most important issue is low wages at the jobs that people have. And I'm just gonna, we also see that Black immigrants have a relatively high rate of entrepreneurship. About 11% of Black immigrants in California are self-employed. This is of the ages 16 to 64. That's much higher than the rate for Black US born. And by the way, this contrast between immigrant and US born is also there for Latino immigrants and AAPI immigrants, that immigrants are just generally more likely to be self-employed than their US born ethnic counterparts. So what do I take away from this data analysis? I think when I give talks, it's always really important to think about the 10 key takeaways, 10 key takeaways from the work. And I want to lift these up and then open ourselves up to a conversation. The first is the tension between invisibility versus hypervisibility. What do I mean? In the data, in policy, in immigration movements, and in immigration considerations, Black immigrants are often invisible. However, when you look at the deportation and criminalization machine, they're hypervisible, as can be seen in the twofold increase of Black people in terms of their share of immigrants to their share of those who are in ICE proceedings, or the shift once you're in ICE to being in solitary confinement. So there's a hypervisibility of Black immigrants, a criminalization, even as so many of these issues are invisible. Second, there are diverging Black experiences, in particular between Black immigrants, second generation, kids of those Black immigrants, and US-born African Americans. Divergence in terms of education, divergence in terms of other factors. There are certainly bridge builders, two I mentioned, Nipsey Hussle and Issa Rae, but there's also diverging Black experiences, and there are also diverging Black experiences by region of origin and whether or not where you live, San Diego, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and you saw so many differences in terms of whether you were from West Africa, East Africa, or from Central America. Third key takeaway for me is disconnected diasporas. That is, that we've got this big diaspora from Africa and from the Caribbean, but how do we kind of create the bridges of these different diasporas, both to the places from where people came, but also broader bridges between these different groups? And that's why this conference today, speaking about both African and immigrants and Caribbean immigrants in the same breath, in the same space, very, very important. Fourth, reconsidering Latinidad. What do I mean by this? When we talk about Latinos, we often include folks of every racial group who mark themselves as a Latino on the census. And while that's important, it sometimes plays into a mythology of mestizaje, easy racial mixing in Mexico and in Central America, or the idea of racial democracy in places like Brazil or Colombia. But if you're familiar with those places, there's rank racism and racial discrimination, particularly against Black Latin Americans. Coming into the United States is not designed to sort of take the black anti-blackness out of you. This is a country that reinforces it. And so the attitudes that people have get reproduced. And so it becomes incredibly important to start to think about how do we consider the situation of Afro-Latinos? How do we break down the Latino identity to lift up Black immigrants? Fifth big theme is that it's important to realize, particularly when a community is relatively small and growing, that one needs independent Black space. So it's incredibly important to have conferences like this. I feel so privileged to have been invited in to participate and present on the data side. And I'm quite aware that there are spaces that need to be Black only, and that we need to be supportive of creating those spaces so that they can exist and so that people can find their voice, their power, their story. The sixth big lesson for me constantly, and this is for the broader immigrant rights movement, is understanding. I mean, I just was pointing out the home ownership thing, the continuing disparities at each and every level of education. If you were a Black, regardless of whether you're immigrant or US born, the need to tackle anti-Black racism in the way that it affects both African Americans and Black immigrants. And to understand that it is anti-Black racism that's also been super key to creating a terrain of othering and marginalization that's affected the experiences of Latinos and Asian Americans. I think Bill Heng would agree that while the roots of anti-Asian hate and racism certainly are deep in this country with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment, and so many other things, that the reinforcement by anti-Black racism is incredibly key. And so all of us, regardless of our own ethnic group, if we're supportive of immigrant rights and supportive of justice in general, that what we need to do is to center anti-Black racism in our work. And that leads to recommendation 7, which is addressing anti-Black racism within our organizations. Understanding that the exclusion of Black immigrant experiences is not simply a result of small numbers, because apparently, despite the small numbers, you could do a 50-minute presentation on the data. That's in part the kind of anti-Black racism that people carry with them into organizations and that we need to address. 8th big lesson, for all of this to be lifted up, we need to build movement capacity. That's general movement capacity for the immigrant rights and racial justice movements, but it's in particular thinking about how to drive funders to helping to create movement capacity for the networks that I highlighted, African Communities Together, the Priority African Network, Haitian Bridge Alliance, Black Immigration Network, BAJI, the African Advocacy Network. How do those get built, and others, to be strong advocates? 9th big lesson, we need to build a broad movement. If we really want racial justice in this country and immigrant integration, it needs to include everyone. But even as we do this, we need to make sure that it's grounded in themes of racial justice, youth organizing, and so much more. So I'm going to stop sharing and start looking at the issues that are being raised in the chat. And I don't know how you all want to handle those questions. Karina, whether you want to, since I haven't been able to see them, maybe organize and ask me a few of them.
Yes, and I think Hamida is going to take care of this part of the conversation. So go ahead, Hamida.
Yeah, thank you for such a lovely presentation. I think we do have a few questions in the chat, and we can begin. I don't know if you can see them. Some of them are in the chat, some as well in the Q&A. And we can start with Nuna's question, and she asked if we can have, if you can perhaps share a sketch of what we could expect from the census, of the 2020 census, that are more specific to Black immigrants and migrants.
God, what a good question, and shout outs to Nunu, who has inspired us to be allies in this work and with the data skills that we might be able to bring. I would say that the thing we need to be concerned about is what we should have expected from the census and what we're likely to get. What we should have expected from the census, for those of you on the ground, is a significant growth in the Black immigrant community and an increasing diversity of folks, and in particular, certainly a growth, if it could be picked up in the current population survey, of the second generation issues that I was mentioning. But I am worried about the intersection of two or three things that I think are really, really important. One is the undercount of immigrants generally, because the result is the Trump administration's trying to interject a citizenship question, which scared people off. The fact that COVID occurred and that led a lot of people to not, that the ground game was not as profound as it could be. And then, of course, in general, things like the public charge rule, which made people much more reluctant to engage with the government. So we were going to get an undercount of the immigrant community. That is combined with something which I think speaks to the invisibilization that I talked about. Because so many of us were concerned about the intersection of the intentional anti-immigrant attitudes and practices with the census, we really focused in on coming up with hard to count measures that were focused on immigrant communities. The problem with that is there's always been a traditional undercount of Black people generally. And we actually worked with UCLA and with the Black Census Hub to develop a specific set of measures of the Black hard to count. Because a lot of Black immigrants live in Black, but traditionally African-American communities. And if those communities are undercounted, the immigrants within them will be undercounted as well. And I'm really concerned that we didn't, as much as we tried, and hopefully it did make a difference, that, when we were so focused on the immigrant underground, we invisibilized the Black undercount, and we needed to really make up for that in very profound ways. And then I'm kind of concerned that there's continuing shenanigans going on to try to limit who gets counted. So the real answer is we should have seen an increase, given all the trends, in Black immigrant communities and in their diversity. But I don't know whether that's really going to show up in the census. And that's going to be a really important issue to struggle about in the years to come.
And I think we have another question coming up, perhaps regarding your data presentation. And Jean-Claude does ask, what is it that attracts perhaps Black immigrants to these specific cities, for example, LA, the Bay Area, as well as San Diego? What are exactly the pull and push factors that are driving them?
That's a really good question. And I think that some of it is the typical trying to go places where other people went first, and then building on that because you might be able to find more comfort. So whoever were the first people to arrive in the Bay Area, thank you. You've attracted a lot more. I think, City Heights in San Diego has proved to be a particularly, San Diego took in a lot of refugees from Ethiopia and elsewhere. There's the group in San Diego that is an African immigrant group as well, PANA, I think reflects the next generation of folks who've been there. But that what I think happens is that you start to see a community and you say, well, that's a place that, whatever the beach hold was in the first place, it's kind of the next place where the next group of people want to go, because you're going to be able to find family members, people who might understand your experience, people who might actually be able to cook your food in restaurants, people who might understand your worship, where there might be mosques, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a little bit of it is San Diego took in immigrants. I think in part their South LA has also been somewhat attractive just because it was the heart of the Black community in Los Angeles. And then there was also quite a strong Afro-Belizean community that was there for quite some time. And I think that was a bit of an attraction as well. Bay Area, man, I want to hear your story though. You all got a lot of numbers. What do you think it is, Amina?
I'm not sure. I mean, I ended up coming to grad school at San Francisco too, so I might eventually as well join these statistics. So I think, yeah, the existence of a community that pretty much feels a lot like home is part of it.
Yeah, you should stay, man. Hayward, Oakland, it's all beautiful.
We try to keep it a secret, Manuel. Hey, Amira, I wonder if I can interject a question here to Dr. Pastor. Because we have so many students in the audience, a number of graduate students as well, I'm wondering, how do we grow up to be you? What are some of the skills that you would advise graduate students to hone in order to make the kinds of contributions that you have?
Gosh, that's such a generous question. I would say two things which might seem striking in a bit of a contradiction maybe for some people, but I think they're not a contradiction for me. The first is if you can, learn to love data. It's a really useful skill. Communities need it. It helps to answer questions like, people say, well, we don't have the numbers. And you can just go, no, wait a minute, we do have the numbers. And there's no excuse not to look at the numbers. And then to understand the power of those need to be told with stories. I hope I told some stories along the way that made the numbers jump out and be somewhat lively. But I think learning to love numbers and mapping and how to be accurate about that. We have a saying in my shop, Bill, if you found something interesting, you're probably wrong, which means you should go back and double check to make sure you got the numbers right. Because in the way to generate this report, this PowerPoint, we found some really interesting stuff was just wrong. We just did it wrong. So we are very, very careful. The second thing, which I would say, I guess this is a big set of things, is to practice humility and solidarity. The humility of understanding that no matter what skills I develop, there's nothing like the lived experience of Hamida or Habibo or Nunu or so many others that I've been able to be in contact with. And I think if you can do solidarity or with humility, then you might find yourself being asked as a Latino academic to present on Black academics, on Black immigrants in California, which, it feels like an honor. It feels like an invitation that I feel so honored to have received, that there's a trust that I'm enough of an ally that I can present this data with an eye toward trying to figure out how can I be replaced by Black immigrant graduate students who learn to love data, who practice humility, and understand deeply solidarity?